Welcome to the Reiki Healing Summit 2021, a free online event where you'll learn from some of the world's leading Reiki healers and energy medicine pioneers how to unveil all your inner resources and forge a new path that will divinely transform the way you see yourself and the world we live in. This event is brought to you by Reiki Rays, a global community of Reiki practitioners and teachers dedicated to creating a brighter and more aware future for us all, using Reiki as a healing tool. Reiki can change our human story, but it's up to us to lead the way. Share this inspiring event with your friends and family, and come join us at reikirays.com/summit 2021. And now meet your summit host, Karen Kag.
Hello, my name is Karen Kag, and welcome to the Reiki Rays Summit 2021. And I'm so excited today to have Renee Vöckli here with me from Lucerne, Switzerland. Hello, Renee.
Hi.
I'm so excited to have you here today. Let me share, if you don't know Renee, let me share a little bit about his biography with you. He was born an only child in 1953 and raised in Switzerland. He felt drawn to go abroad and explore the world, working in many different professions. He's lived in England, Eastern Europe, Africa, and Asia. And he married Misha Vöckli Eckloff in 1980, with whom he has 2 sons and a grandson. In March 1991, he found Reiki and a time of transformation began. Since 1993, he's been a full-time Reiki professional in partnership with his wife. And from 1996 to 2002, he served on the committee of the International Association for Reiki Teachers, the Reiki Network. At the end of 2010, he and his wife, Misha, together with 2 partners, founded Reiki International Organization, which he led until its closure in 2017. He's co-founder and was a member of the Council of Pro Reiki since its start in 2009. And together with a group of presidents of national inclusive associations, they founded the European Reiki Group, or ERG, in 2018. He's the author of Weltverbesserer, a German Reiki novel, and now I'm going to have to brush up my German and go get that. I want to hear more about that maybe. And in his life management seminars, he teaches 7 steps to resolve rigid belief systems, something we could all use. As a Reiki teacher, he understands that the process of acknowledging guilt or injury, of regretting and apologizing, of making and accepting amends, in a word, the process of forgiving, is central to healing in both individuals and in organizations. And since 2020, he has been the host of the talk show, Our Talk, which I really enjoy. Look forward to getting those in my email box. So Renee, I'm so happy to have you here today. And since we are talking about reconciliation in the Reiki community, I want to specifically ask you to start with about the documentary interview with Phyllis Furumoto called Reconciliation Along the Path to Mastery. Can you tell us, share with our viewers, why the movie was made and what its main message is, and also why did you conserve all the raw material in an archive and make this accessible to others?
Yes.
That's a big question.
Let me try and remember all the parts. So let
me go back. So just why did you make this movie?
Why did we make that movie? Well, the fact is that within the Reiki community in the past, let's say in the past 40 years, there were moments of what I call dissonance. Dissonance is a beautiful word for being neutral about situations where people are at each other's throat. As we all know, Reiki people are human beings, and the Reiki masters are very much human beings. So it is in a natural a course of events that sometimes dissonances occur. And they have led, particularly in the 90s and the 2000 years, sometimes to a lot of polemics and polarization within the Reiki community. And then in the center, from my perspective, from a Western Reiki perspective, in the center of these dissonances, there were actually a few or very few protagonists. And one of them was Phyllis Furumoto, who was one of the most prolific, the most successful, the most visible Reiki teachers of contemporary times. And then Phyllis became the honorary member of the association in Germany you mentioned, the Inclusive National Association Pro Reiki. And I wasn't there at that moment. A student of ours, of my wife and mine, was there. And she gave a speech, and she surprised a lot of people by her openness and by her, what I would now call a conciliatory spirit. Now, which brings up an interesting question. Didn't she always have that spirit, and it was just other people's perception and projection that she wouldn't have that? But anyhow, she gave that speech and everybody was enthused, so much so that our student took Phyllis aside and said, "Oh, I'd like to put the camera on you, I have a few questions." And the student then showed me that video afterwards and said, "What do you think about it, Renee? Would you like to help me distribute it in the world?" And I said, "No, you missed a great opportunity. Why didn't you come to me in the first place? I could have given you some of the historic background and you could have asked some really exciting questions." So there we were, the two of us saying, what are we going to do now? And I then suggested, why don't you ask her, now that you have a personal relationship, I didn't have any personal relationship with her at all, whether she'd be agreeable to do the movie you're referring to. And she agreed. That's how it all came about. And it was quite an adventure, I can tell you, and maybe just very briefly, anecdotally, it is typical for Phyllis, it appears, certainly for my experience with her, was I went to, after some back and forth on Skype and Zoom and discussions, we met for filming in Berlin. So I went up to Berlin and we filmed for 2 days, in the first lot, the first 6 hours of interview. And then after that, she asked me to bring her to the airport. She was carrying on to Holland. And it turned out she wanted to have a sit down with me and an eye-to-eye talk with me over a cup of coffee. And it turned out that it was very important to her to hear my answer to the question, why are you doing this? And don't ask me what I responded. I can't exactly remember, but I did know I needed to speak from the bottom of my heart. I needed to dip into what I consider my calling, the reason why I'm here. And I needed to tap that source to give her a response. And I find it remarkable because most other people would ask before the filming, why do you want to do this, etc., etc. What are your credentials? Can I trust you? And so on. But not her. She listened to her intuition and then decided, I'll do this movie with him. And afterwards, she started to ask all these questions. So after these 2 days, I went into about half a year of research where I contacted about 100 Reiki people from all over the world, basically asking them one question, and that was, if you were me, what is the most burning question you would like me to ask of Phyllis Furumoto? And of course, I asked some of her contemporaries who were some of those protagonists in the theater of dissonance. And then I went to Arizona and filmed the last 2 days. which then culminated in her making an apology for transgressions which happened in the past, which is highly remarkable and, in my estimation, a historic moment. Then I went back and I went through an agonizing time of producing this. This was one of the most painful phases in my life. And one of the, and that's the second part of your question, one of the realizations I made, that no matter how I cut and edited the 14 hours of raw material, it would always leave room open for people to interpret it from their own bias point of view. And you know, her friends and people who adhere to her style of Reiki, they would project and see from their point of view, and those who were on the other side of the coin, so to speak. And I then decided I'm going to make the whole of the 14 hours of material available. And in those 14 hours, I can't remember, it was 12 hours maybe, in this raw material anyhow, I covered so many topics, you know, historic topics, very personal topics. I asked intimate questions like how much money she made with Reiki. And then we went off into entirely different spheres of spirituality, the reconciliation process, what that meant, and so on. So anyone who has questions about what I call the main feature, which is a 50-minute film, Reconciliation Along the Path of Mastery, that's the film you referred to, and has questions, could refer to what I call the archive. That's the raw materials which are cut up in 66 videos, and they're actually called 66 steps on the path to reconciliation. So I find that there is an immense historic value in those 66 videos. For example, many of the Reiki books I researched were not saying much about, you had Hawayo Takata, and then you had Phyllis, but there was Phyllis's mother in between, Alice. Alice Furumoto. What was her role? So in the 66 videos, there is good answers to those questions. So you had a long question. I gave an even longer answer.
That was a long question, but what you've done for the history of Reiki is just that's incredible also, because that when we try to go back and study, you know, there are so many holes and we don't know. And I think that especially with the break that happened in the Reiki community, that's a huge contribution to what, and this is what Reiki is about. It's about healing. And so that's part of, when you said that was part of your calling. I know that really wasn't on the list of questions, but I know that you have had to deal with that some yourself. Did that play a role, do you think, in moving you toward, because that's pretty, it takes some courage to say, hey, I would like to make a film. I'm not a filmmaker, but I'd like to make a film. Could you share a little bit about what drives you to do this?
Yeah, good question. A very existential, central question for my life personally. You said earlier, you know, holes in history. Let me comment that first. I don't think it's so much about filling the holes, the gaps, you know, with historic facts. I think that's important. But no matter how much we fill discrepancies, misunderstandings, and so on, there will always, because we are human beings, there will always be one's own personal take of history and so on. So it's more about coming to a point where we're starting to recognize you've got a different viewpoint of the same situation I'm looking at, different viewpoint from me. We can even disagree with each other as long as we are in agreement of disagreeing, as long as we are in a conciliatory state. And that's the objective of the game. Now, to your question, I didn't realize that for a long time, and the work with Phyllis, and that was only the first project of a number of projects. The European Reiki Group is another one of the projects within the conciliatory effort I'm involved in, or I'm trying to contribute to. And in that process, I came to understand that my life was pretty much punctuated with occurrences of reconciliation acts, of coming to understand there was transgression. Parties want to heal that. How does one go about it? For example, and to make it also a little bit light, well, I was running an American trading company in Korea. We are talking the 80s, the late 80s. I took over as the managing director there. Basically, after 6 months, my wife was very pregnant with our second child. The Korean CIA literally ransacked our office. So they came just in and they took everything. And what happened was that in the past there have been inaccuracies, not a nice word for not calling a crime. There have been inaccuracies in the past which led to the then biggest tax evasion scandal between the United States and another country, or representatives of another country, and I was handling that at that moment. I got in the middle of that, and for 2 years, and there were amazing situations which included people who, at one point in time, I don't want to make that over dramatic now, but one particular person tried to bribe me, tried to blackmail me, tried to misbehave towards me. Mm-hmm. And the point is not so much his misbehavior, but in the process, towards the end, I came to a point where I needed to make a decision. How do I find solutions also with respect to that person? So one part in me said, put him to prison forever, throw away the key, revenge. Mm-hmm. And this is just very few years before I got to Reiki, but it was pre-Reiki. And yet something inside me said, but that's nobody is going to benefit from that. It's just satisfying another desire, an unworthy thing. So I needed to go to the person. How could we resolve this? And I was lucky that I had good people helping me finding constructive solutions, making win-win situations. And that doesn't imply that that person, the wrongdoing was sort of swept under the carpet. Not at all. I think this is one of the biggest problems in processes of reconciliation, and even in daily life between human beings like you and me. I step on your toe and you say, it's okay, we have something more important to do now. But it is your wounded foot already, and it's painful to you. And all too easily, people sort of say, let's forget it, let's move on with life. So a reconciliation process does not include, it's not, forgiving is not forgetting. And already then in this business situation, as one of the anecdotes in my life, in hindsight, I can look back and say that was a reconciliation process I was involved in.
So what I really hadn't thought about before until as you're speaking is that it seems like if you stepped on my toe, I would say like, oh, that's okay. That's all right. That's fine. I'm all right. Go on. But because I would think it's not necessary to bring up something like, hey, stop. Let me tell you how this makes me feel that you step on my toe, because it seems like that. And especially after it's happened, how do you go back then and say, this happened in the past? Isn't that just sort of like opening up an old wound and bringing up things that have already happened? Why is it necessary to address it?
And
spell it out?
Is it necessary in all circumstances to address it? And the answer to that is there is no recipe answer to that question. I think, in let's say psychoanalytical circles of the past, I don't think modern psychoanalysis does this anymore, but of the past, people tended to dig into old stuff and reopen old wounds, kind of thing. I don't think that certainly must not be the objective of the game, of a reconciliation process. And it's a very delicate thing to do. So very often reconciliation actually needs to be done by the victim or the offender, depending on which side, on his own, without being able to include the other side. For example, if you look at, and there are some beautiful documentaries about this, about people who have committed serious big crimes like murder and who are in prison, very often you hear them that after many years, they're saying, I cannot go and ask for forgiving from the parents of the child I killed. Who am I to ask this? So he or she needs to go through that process, it appears, on her own. And then again, there's so many examples. To this day, there are survivors from the Holocaust who travel around schools in Germany, old people, 18, 90-year-old people.
We have them here where I taught. They would come and speak to the students.
Exactly. And they're involving, so the Holocaust survivor would be the victim, and he would go to schools, and there are children who are great-grandchildren maybe of offenders. And in fact, my own research about my own father disclosed something. I didn't know who my father was until I was about 40 years and started to go through a reconciliation process with somebody I never even knew and who had died, it turned out, in 1988. And he left behind a widow, and I got to know her. That's a long story. But the point was that he was a prisoner of war. He actually came from an area in northern Germany, which was very popular for the German regime to recruit sturdy soldiers from. And he was a Nazi fighter in the Russian war, and he became a prisoner of war. So in my own history, all of a sudden, I have a Nazi, my father was a Nazi. So how do I deal with this, and what does that mean to me? So this coming back to your question, one needs to be very careful not to open wounds in this process. And yes, it is possible to come to a conclusion and the conclusion serves a purpose to finish something for the benefit of the future and the generations ahead of us. So it is possible to do that on one's own, and certainly very often it is done without the actual addressing of the incidents. But, it's important that the Nazi survivors are coming to our schools and talk about the incidents and the trials, the peace and reconciliation trials in Africa, in South Africa and Burundi. It was very important that they had the victims who talked about the pain inflicted by the genocide and the people, the soldiers who did the killing, that they were there and that they had to listen to this. So sometimes it's very important. And I don't think personally that the gravity of the offense is an invitation to take it lightly. I think the process is the same, whether it's very severe or whether I only stepped on your foot, which is in pain already.
So what is the value of admitting or recognizing that I have been either a victim or the transgressor?
You know,
What happens when I do that?
This to me is one of the most staggering things in the work I do when I have victims. I call it the heroism of the victim. That's what I call it. That's the term I gave it.
I love it. The heroism of the victim.
Yes. And this is when the victim fully integrates and fully and unconditionally accepts that the transgression was wrong and I was an utter victim, innocent, and it in its absoluteness, to integrate the consciousness of not I'm holding a victim role all my life. That's a different ball game. That's what people get confused. And because a lot of people want to not get into that kind of role, they find it very difficult to look at the situation in the past and say, but in that moment, when that car hit me, or my wife was hit by a snowboard racer, from behind. My wife was standing still on the ski slope, and she had brain hemorrhage, and her skull was broken in 5 places. Very severe, right? And very, very severe. And the power and the heroism of the victim is when the victim says, that was wrong. Because I liken it to this picture. The power of the victim over the offender is, and you know that maybe between you and your husband, that, you know, we have these little calculations most of the time in our heads. He's done this wrong, that wrong. They're nothing in themselves, but we keep tab on them, maybe not consciously. And keeping tab of those things gives us maybe the illusion, but it gives us some sort of like power over the other person, because the day will come when I do something wrong, and then we can say, but yesterday, and then and the day before, and last week, and then the whole tabulation is being rambled off. So the power of the victim is like a sword he or she holds over the offender.
I see that.
And it's a constant threat.
And there can be no healing. There can be no moving forward.
On either side, there can be healing. And for the victim, to the first step to say, I was a victim at that time, is like taking, because that arm gets tired from holding up that sword over the head of the, and we have the feeling, but you've done me wrong, and I'll never forget it, and I'll never forgive it, and it's such an effort. And the moment the victim says that was wrong, but I'm going to heal, and I'm going to take that sword back, and I'll ram it next to me into the ground, that act is so liberating, and that is the precondition to start going into a reconciliatory process, whichever way, whether it's through directly addressing the incidents or through more symbolic, ritualistic, other processes. And within Reiki, of course, we have a method, an energy, if you will, which is facilitating that process of healing. And then the liberation, and it's just so unbelievably liberating for the victim in my picture, but also equally to the offender.
It is.
Because without that threat of the of the sword over his head is maybe the first time he can have the freedom to realize what he's done wrong, for true remorse to happen, for truly understanding I have transgressed, for sincerely apologizing and asking for forgiving. Because when I step on your foot and I say, I'm so sorry, and I keep walking, that's not an apology.
No. I didn't know I was going to share this, but I was a victim of sexual abuse when I was a child, and I just sort of pushed it away. And it wasn't until I found Reiki that I did exactly what you said, when I finally went like, no, that was wrong. I mean, it wasn't because that's a really complicated sort of a thing, because you think, oh, maybe I did something wrong, or what did I, do to encourage that? Or, I used to think, was it just like written across my forehead because it happened with more than one person? And the fact that I could finally go like, no, that was wrong. And that wasn't my fault. And Reiki helped me get to that point. And then one of my abusers is someone in my family, and I did confront him later. I mean, not but just to talk about it, to say, to bring it to the surface. And I didn't know what was going to happen. But when you were holding your hand up there, like it's like it changed, it shifted everything, especially for me. And I think for this man as well, because, and I asked him why. And he said, that was wrong. I shouldn't have done that. And if I had never had enough healing to admit that I was a victim in this, it never would have moved forward. And it was just like, in fact, when you were talking, I felt my body even go, like just relax, in just the memory of how that felt, to bring that to the surface and have a reconciliation, to.
Well, there you go. This is heroism in my book.
Yes, in a way, it is.
It is incredible, because the admission, you used the words, that's one of the elements in the process on the victim side. That allowed, and you have no responsibility. Let's be clear about that. You
like
have
your wife.
no
I mean, you
responsibility
just
for the offender's admission, but very often that opens the possibility of the offender coming to and then he also can ideally go the next step, and then the two people can enter actually the reconciliation process with, by the way, reparation. Reparation is something which is also, we hardly have a good forgiving culture in our society, in our Western society. There are other cultures where it's different, and ironically, we often call them primitive cultures.
Yeah, ironically. Yeah, we struggle with that in the United States with our race relations and the things that, I mean, we're struggling with it right now. That's why I was so excited to see that you were going to talk about this topic, because and maybe it's time. Maybe this is where we're moving. Maybe this is where Reiki is helping us to heal. I do want to ask you, what do people do? What could they do? You mentioned something about ceremonies or something. I'm not sure if that's what it was, but what if you are trying to have a reconciliation with someone who is already dead? I mean, how can a reconciliation take place, say with, well, like your father, or I'm thinking of my parents, because we're human, we all have things. How can we have a reconciliation with someone who's already gone?
Yeah. First, let me just say, it's such a privilege to speak to you in this realm of consciousness, right? You've done your work, I've done my work, and here there are two people who are talking to each other. And we've got a realm of consciousness. And this is a great, 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 great privilege. And I believe that particularly Reiki people have the privilege of evolving that consciousness. It's a privilege and a responsibility, or maybe if one doesn't like the word responsibility, you can use the word opportunity. Because, and this is partly why I'm so committed to doing the work I'm doing now. If not we, the Reiki community, to go through a reconciliation process, then who? And if we teach our students in Reiki class, whatever you don't heal now, and I'm not necessarily referring to reconciliation, behavior patterns, etc., etc. Whatever you don't heal now may well be passed on to the generations which follow you. And this, coming back to Phyllis, this is the main reason why Phyllis entered the conversation, and I also entered the conversation, because we both said, let's use the opportunity while we are still around. Let's clean up our own mess, which we've created for understandable and forgivable reasons, so that the future generations, they can create their own mess. But they don't need to mop up ours.
Yeah, but so absolutely, it's such a gift what she did.
So to answer your question, I think there are many ways to go to Rome. So what you asked initially, does it need to be addressed? Does it need to go through all the elements of reconciliation and so on? Sometimes yes, and sometimes maybe there are other more gentle ways. By the way, the art talks, which you mentioned, they are a much gentler way of reconciling within the Reiki community. So there are different ways to do that.
That's why
So for an individual, and let's remember, reconciliation is always between human beings. It cannot be done between organizations or countries. They're only representatives. It needs to be done on an individual basis. So if you come to a point where you can truly say, and let's use your example. I understand your parents have passed away?
Yes, both of them.
So let's say, and most of us have a reconciliation process with our own parents, big or small, doesn't matter. So let's assume you come to the point where you truly, in the heart of hearts, you can say to yourself, and maybe it's good for you to have not your girlfriend, not your best friend, unless she is a counselor of some sorts and can be unbiased in these matters. But if you have a partner who can test you, who can give you feedback or mirror, to be sure that it's truly in the heart of hearts that you have let go of the grudges of that which you had been holding on, the sword kind of. And if you've come to that point, then it's extremely valuable. I go as far as saying it's extremely important that you anchor that newly reached conclusion or insight, that newly reached level of consciousness by anchoring it in a ritualistic kind of way. That can be done in many different ways. And I remember that because you asked about my father, when I came to realize that I wasn't in the clear with my biological father, I wasn't aware of that because he was never around, so why would I have a problem? But then I came with 38 or thereabouts, I came to realize I'm still carrying this. And then I used Reiki very intensely to help me in the process to come to that point of reconciliation, of true forgiving, to the heart of heart point. And then I did a ritual. And actually, you mentioned my book. It's funny that my process coincided with the writing of the book. And part of the
Viscera.
Exactly. Part of that book, I ritualistically burned in my home and I dug the ashes into a small garden in our home in Greece. And then a few months later, I was in Germany and I met a very wise woman. And I told her this. And she said, no, it's not strong enough, your ritual. You fooled yourself, Rene, she said to me. And I remember my ego, because this old wise woman happened to be also a Reiki student of mine, you know, and my ego going, how dare she speak to me? And thanks God, sometimes I manage to eat my own medicine. So I'm listening to what I'm teaching my students sometimes also, and hopefully more and more often in my own life. And I listened to her, and she said, no, you need to do more. You can't just burn a little paper and think this is it. You're fooling yourself. And I went back and I went to my living mother, my biological mother, and lo and behold, for the first time, she gave me information I didn't even know she had. And that's when my journey to actually look for my father started. And that only afterwards I found out that he had died already and that he was buried in northern Italy. So I decided to go to northern Italy and do a ritual on on the graveyard where he's buried. So big effort, right?
A pilgrimage.
A pilgrimage. And in this process, I also discovered that he left a widow behind. You know, in the research, I discovered that there's a widow who, by the way, was pregnant at the same time where he impregnated my mother, both of them being 18 and 17 years old. So, and this other woman was alive. And it's a complicated story. I'll give you the short version. I got to talk to her, and without revealing who I was, right? I didn't want to offend her. I didn't want to tear up old wounds in her case. So, and then she told me that she had 4 children. So I was a single child, and all of a sudden I had 4 half siblings.
Oh, that's amazing.
Amazing, absolutely amazing. And it's a significant part of the ritualistic of you. The more you put into the ritual of anchoring your newly achieved state of true forgiving, of reconciliation, the more doors open. And all of a sudden I had a brother and a sister. And in the meantime, I've been guest of honor at the wedding of a relative. And I got introduced formally to the widow of my father, she knowing that I'm a child of her husband. And she is now 87 years old. My mother is 85, and the 2 women are friends.
Wow. That's an amazing story.
I mean,
I have to repeat what you said. You said the more you put into the ritual, into your healing, then the more opportunities arise. It's like the more effort you put into it, the deeper you go, the more comes up to meet you. More opportunities.
I even was referring only to the end, when you've reached the state of heart of hearts, of healing, where you feel you've forgiven your parents, your offender in your own life.
You got a bigger picture of what was going on. That happened for me too. I couldn't understand from my perspective what you were talking about at the beginning. Like we all see things through our experiences, and I was still looking from a child's perspective. And then I would like, my dad did the best he could do. At the time, and I began to see patterns of what he was doing, and I could understand things. So
the problem with that is that very often we find those explanations before we've truly admitted that he's offended, that he has done wrong.
Right.
We start to diminish the act of transgression by already adding those explanations.
That was the next question. Well, it kind of relates to that. I wanted to ask about whether or not dissonance is a healthy aspect of life. Like some people may argue, well, doesn't evolution, thrive from a tension field of like thesis, antithesis, synthesis? Is that, or should people just focus on that harmonious goal at the end? Is that where you're going with this?
Focusing on the harmonious goal at the end is what most people like to do almost as a matter of course, as a reflex. That's why you and I step on your foot. I would say sorry, and you would say it's okay, because we'd rather get on with life and we'd rather carry on and so on. So this may be a way of dissolving things. I'm not saying this is not legitimate. That's one.
But it's just the surface.
But that's one answer, and you know what's in the fairy tale, and if they haven't died, they live happily ever after. So if that's the state you've reached, great. Is it like a natural evolutionary? Is it a precondition that we first need to clash to come to terms? No, it isn't. But the friction creates warmth, and from warmth, new things can come. So it can be a natural tension and a natural, and like in discussions, I mean, there's a whole philosophical school in Tibet which is working exactly on what you said. I have a thesis, you bring an antithesis, and we clash full, and from it, there synergetically unfolds a synthesis, which of course is only the new thesis for an antithesis, and so it continues.
Yeah.
So sure, that's part of nature, and that is also part of us. I venture to say that human beings have what I referred to earlier as consciousness, and I think that we can observe a lot of that, and we can, like I also said earlier, we can observe and come to the conclusion we disagree on something, and we need to discuss, but I'm not going to dislike you because you have a different opinion. And if I feel that hatred or dislike is coming up in me, I think humanity today, and we Reiki people in particular, are more and more often capable of saying, wait a minute, that which comes up now in me says nothing about Karen. It says only something about Rene, his expectations of that woman on the other side of the ocean.
Yeah, you're right.
And that I can deal with, and then I can enter a conversation with you, or a dialogue, a confrontational dialogue about something we may disagree. But then it's not charged. Then it's on a constructive level, and that's, I think, the aim we should all aim for. Thus, within the art talks, which you referred to earlier, the subtitle is Agree to Disagree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
A beautiful English word. We don't have to.
Yeah, it is. Agree to disagree. So how do you see the result of your work? Like, what do you think the future holds for you in this work?
I am so thrilled because catalyzed by whatever, and a lot of it, like when you refer to America in a political, economic context, the zeitgeist we are in, Corona and everything, there's a lot of catalysts, whatever those catalysts, but the processes of reconciliation, that kind of consciousness I was referring to, you see that flare up in so many spots. Within the Reiki community, there are so many groups who consciously work on a reconciliation as such. So many groups who don't have that as a topic, but they have the topic of inclusiveness. Yeah. So many associations which say, and the summit is part of it, right? You never asked me which Reiki tradition do I come from. You respected me for whatever my tradition is. So that's an inclusive spirit. So many organizations are busy with inclusiveness. Well, inclusiveness is a way of integrating, is a way of creating a conciliatory environment. So this happens all over, and I think it's so exciting. There are setbacks, Of course, new fights flaring up or old wounds breaking up, and I would like to think in the Reiki environment, they break up because they need to break up still, right? It's not a forced or an artificial kind of vengeful reopening of an old thing, but it's simply the recognition we need to readdress this. So yes, this is happening. And I see more of this happening. 2022, we've just, we, Reiki Conciliation, whom I stand for, have just put a map online where all the different groups who are celebrating in 2022 can show their little light and put themselves on the map. And
I love that. I saw that. I love it.
And I just received this morning a young man in Canarian Islands in Spain who put his event onto the map. And, it shows a community, and that's the purpose, the greater vision behind my work, and in particular on that map, to show ourselves and the world, yes, we are different. Thanks God for that, we are different. But we can celebrate oneness in that diversity of our existence, and the 2022 celebration, 100 years of Reiki celebration, are a great occasion to do that. So the art talks, to me, if I may mention them, I'm having people in my talk show of so many different walks of life of Reiki. They're world famous Reiki masters, and they're Reiki 1 practitioners who nobody knows that they're even practicing Reiki. They may be a famous conductor, they may be a completely unfamous person, but a person who has something interesting to say. And there are 2 things we don't talk about generally in these art talks. Art talk as in Reiki and as in reconciliation. But I never speak about Reiki, and I never speak about reconciliation in these talks. And I never speak to, let's say, a grandmaster or a head of school or head of discipline of one school about Reiki, because instantly he will probably, or she will probably, show her version. That's not wrong, but that instantly is almost polarizing people who have a different perception from other traditions. And Reiki Conciliation is about reconciling all these different tribes. So by not talking about Reiki in the art talks, I don't have that dilemma. And that means I'm having a representative of the most diverse Reiki styles you can imagine. And I know of a hotel in London where in the early 2000 years, one Reiki master checked in and somehow learned that another Reiki master from another tribe was staying at the same hotel, and he immediately left and changed the hotel. People like that now, and it's not to judge them then.
Right, I know.
We've behaved like that one way or the other. All of us have, probably. But it's about saying, on reconciliation, I have people like these 2, and they're talking also not about reconciliation, because as we found out, that can be a very heavy subject. It can open old wounds. It's sometimes more fruitful and more constructive to look at, let's celebrate 2022. Let's do something together, which is reconciling in the making. And that's what I would like to think that the art talks are, reconciling in the making.
They are. I started sharing them in my student group because it shows such a diversity, and it's not to learn about Reiki or not the differences, but just to show the diversity of ideas and people. And because honestly, in America, when I became a Reiki master, it took a while before I'm like, oh, so it was sort of like raising my head and like, oh, look at all these others over here. And so I wanted to share that with my students. So I'm grateful to you for doing those. That's
good.
That's great. So why don't you tell our viewers about the offer that you have? You can go and watch the Phyllis Furumoto Reconciliation Along the Path to Mastery, but the archive, I'm excited about that. Tell our viewers what you're going to offer.
Yes, the archive, the main feature, the 50-minute feature is free of charge. And that's where the important message is, and that had to go. And I believe it's been viewed more than 20,000 times in the meantime. So wonderful. The raw material, the 66 videos, they have to be bought. And what I'm offering, your summit and the code word for the archive would actually be Summit 2021. And I'm offering a 20% discount. So normally the package for all of the 66 videos is $38 US. So minus 20% is my offer to your viewers, and also in recognition for the work of the organizers for this summit.
Great. Well, we appreciate you so much. Thank you so much for starting this conversation. And I'm hoping that everyone who hears it will begin to consider how they deal with reconciling old wounds, victim, transgressor, all of that, and moving forward and healing. So I thank you, and we will talk soon.
I thank you, Karen, and I thank you very much for having made me feel so comfortable in our conversation, and that we were able to speak so freely and spontaneously. Namaste to you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining our 6th edition of the Reiki Healing Summit, brought to you by Reiki Raise. To learn more, visit reikiraise.com/summit 2021. To find out more about our global community and the wide variety of Reiki articles and infographics, free guided meditations, free ebooks or podcasts, online courses, and global summits, visit reikiraise.com. Thank you again for joining us and sharing this event with those who can also benefit from the healing and soul empowerment it brings. Reiki blessings.